this down. So we have picked back up with Job, and we're kind of doing kind of a review, but it's also kind of a quiz, just so that we can bring out some different points as we go. And last week we had gotten to the point, we were talking about how we spent a lot of time discussing why there's evil, pain, and suffering in the world, and how basically I was reviewing a little bit about how we had gone through Thomas Warren's book, Have Atheists Proved There Is No God, where the atheist argument was that because the Bible claims that God is all powerful, God is all good, and yet evil exists, that there's a contradiction there. Because how can those things be true? So we of course we spent several weeks going through an examination of that when we were doing this, but we're just covering it real quickly here, and we're kind of reviewing it. So we talked about what were the points that we could make to counter that argument. And first we talked about what we shouldn't do. And like we said last week, we can't deny that evil exists because we see it. We can't accept that there is no God. We could, but then that would defeat the purpose. We can't just say that we have to rely on faith. We need to be able to actually withstand the argument. And we shouldn't accept a weakened view of God because of that seeming contradiction. So where we ended last week in our review and in our quiz here was we were talking about what are things we need to know and things we need to be able to talk about in order to refute the argument. And I think we had gotten just basically into one of those items, which was about how God created this world I guess let me rephrase that. I guess there were two things that we said, actually. The first thing is what is the overall, to me, the most important thing, which is free choice, free will. Because God gave us free will, that leads to the possibility for there to be evil. And it's not a contradiction because we have that free will. So that's kind of the overarching of principle of everything that we talk about here. But we talked a little bit about how, I think Charles mentioned about, and we kind of talked a little bit about God creating the world in a certain way. And after class, Charles mentioned to me, he's like, but God didn't create the world exactly like it is now, which is true. And I wanted to bring that out. How did God originally create the world? Right, there was no death, right? We didn't have to worry about the pain, the suffering, and all those things because there wasn't any of that. God created the world, and he gave Adam and Eve, two commands? Pretty simple to keep God's word, God's will at that point. And what did they do? Now, and before we get a big head and say, well, it's all their fault. What would we have done in that situation? Would we have made the same decision or not? But so the point is that the world wasn't created exactly the way it is now. It was different, but it still was created to serve God's purpose, which was to give them a choice as to whether they were going to serve him or not. And we're still living that same world. It's just it's a fallen world now. It's different. It's changed. And that's because of people choosing not to do God's will. And that's, once again, a function of our free will. So that kind of is where we got to keep going back to whenever you talk about why does evil exist, and even though God is all powerful and all good.
That's just a false equation, if you will.
Right.
The idea that because God is all powerful, there can't be evil. There's two different dynamics going on. They're not in the same equation.
Right, exactly. And that's why we need to be able to point that out, that we don't accept the premise that's the case. Just because this plus this equals, this plus this and this still exists doesn't equal that. It's an equation that doesn't work. We don't have to accept that premise. We also talked a little bit about how we need to know what evil actually is in order to be able to discuss this. Some people think that things are evil that aren't necessarily evil. Evil is when a being chooses to do something against God's will. And natural disasters, diseases, other things that are, have you ever gotten mad at something that has no thought? Like when you slam your hand with a hammer or something, is that hammer evil? Or things like that. Those things aren't evil. They don't think. There's no will behind them. So we need to make sure that we're discussing what evil actually is whenever we're talking about this. So we talked about those things, and as we were just mentioning, it is not the case that an all-powerful being, and this may be a controversial statement, and here again, I don't want to get deep into it because we talked about it in depth when we were doing it, but it is not the case that an all-powerful being can do anything. And what I mean by that is, as an example, the one that I like the best because it's just easy for my mind to grasp is God cannot create a four-sided triangle. Could he create a four-sided triangle? not under the laws that he's instilled in this world, because a triangle has three sides. So that to argue that an all-powerful being can do anything is not accurate, at least in context of what we're talking about. Could he change the rules? Yeah, he could. But then, once again, that would defeat the purpose, right, behind why he created the world. So some things, in our world, some things cannot be done just because of those laws that have been established. I think some other examples we used was like an axe can't cut wood and then not cut through a person. Like in order for an axe not to harm a person, it would have to be impossible for it to cut through somebody. But then how would it cut through the wood? Like the laws would have to be, laws of physics and laws that have been established in the world would just have to go away. You'd have to totally do away with all those things. Also, it is not the case that good is opposed to evil in such a way that a perfectly good thing, or a being, God, always eliminates evil as far as it can be eliminated, or as far as he can eliminate it. So once again, you go back to that giving free will, freedom of choice on that. Another point that we made is that pain and suffering are often caused by people's choices. Sometimes we harm ourselves by our own choices. Sometimes we're harmed by other people's choices. And so since people are allowed to choose to do wrong, evil and pain exists, and that, can also bring about more pain and suffering. And also, pain serves a purpose. Here again, we went through a bunch of different ways that you talk about it, but, how do you know that you're touching a hot stove? Yeah, how do we teach kids not to touch a hot stove? They can either listen to you, say, don't touch the hot stove, or they can learn by touching the hot stove. So, some of us learn the hard way. Some of us learn easier ways. But it can serve a purpose. And if there were no possibility of pain or harm, there would be no bravery or honor. We hold police officers or firefighters, or at least most people used to, hopefully we still do, in high esteem because they risk their lives to help others and go into dangerous situations. Would that be brave if you couldn't get hurt going into those situations? Or would there be any honor in those situations? No, there wouldn't be. So that serves that purpose. I think we might have mentioned about C.S. Lewis has a lot to talk about with those, if you read some of his material on that. Also, things that can harm people, like natural disasters and diseases, also serve a purpose. Here again, we talked about several things, but the main thing that I always take away is that they remind us that things on this planet are not certain. You can build yourself a huge mansion, but it can be gone just like that, right? I mean, you get an earthquake, you get a flood, you get a tornado, hurricane, any number of things. That mansion that you built, we got a song about that, right? What the wise man built his house upon the rock, but if you build it on a rock here on earth, it's still not going to do you any good. So we know that to me, that's the big thing that those kind of things tell us, is that life's not certain, and no matter how safe you feel, you can't do it on your own. And then lastly, the last thing that I had thought about was that God's view is eternal. There's many people who suffer here that will receive blessings after death. Paul is always somebody that I go to look at. He had the eternal viewpoint. Whenever you look at a lot of what he says about, it's better for me to go to heaven, but I want to stay here to help you. In Scripture, it's often talked about. But the other thing that happens in Scripture, and this is what we talked about last week, is that the discussion of blessings is often misinterpreted to be you're going to receive material blessings or physical blessings here on earth. Sometimes that's true, but I think many of the scriptures that are being used to say, what we talked about it, give to my organization and then you'll be blessed. The health and wealth gospel type stuff, a lot of that is misinterpretation of scripture. So we got to remember God's view is eternal. And that's what we need to try. It's hard for us because we're here on earth, but we need to try to keep our viewpoint as eternal instead of just here. Anybody have anything else that they want to add to that? Like I said, we talked about that a lot over the weeks, and I don't want to go back through several weeks or anything, but I just wanted to bring us back up to speed on that.
Just one quickie side note, as it were. I always found it interesting that as God promised to bless Israel, he included in the law how you're supposed to take care of the poor among you. So while he's saying he's going to bless Israel, that does not mean that those blessings translated to wealth for everyone.
For everybody, yeah. Because and Jesus, what did Jesus say when he's here too? He says the poor will always be with you. Yeah. So yeah, it's not across the board. If you serve me, you're going to get these blessings. That's clear when you go through the scriptures and look at what's said there. So yeah, very, very good point. All right. So after we, sorry. Yeah.
I think we probably need to remember the rules of engagement were decided upon before the foundation of the world. And just because God allows something does not mean he likes it.
Right.
He allowed Adam and Eve to do what they wanted to do.
Right.
He allows you and I. That doesn't mean it's within his will.
Correct. And that's really kind of what we were talking about with that. Like, he allows this to happen because he wanted to provide us the opportunity to choose to serve him or not. And so, yeah, and that was from the foundation of the world. That was what he knew we weren't going to choose, always choose the right thing. So that's why the plan of salvation was put into place, and why that plan was there from the beginning. Yes.
Also, during the time of Adam and Eve, God walked with them.
Right.
And people seem to forget today that God is still with us.
But-
he knows what we do.
But going back to what we talked about how he created the world, he did walk with them and talked with them, but yet he still, even at that time where they knew God, like they knew God personally, even at that time, he still created the world in a way that they had a choice. He gave them enough distance that they had a choice as to whether they were going to do his will or not. And that's really kind of a revelation to me as I was looking at it. Even with the world being where there was no death or anything like that, and there was just a couple of people and only a couple of rules and all that kind of stuff, he still was far enough away from them that they knew he existed. There was proof, there was no doubt about it, but they still had enough room, enough space to make the choice. Anything else? All right, so after we went through that lengthy discussion, we went back to Job, and I guess, actually we did this before we even went to there. We fast-forwarded to the end of Job, and we discussed how Job was blessed after his ordeal. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions on that just to remind us of what happened there. Why did God bless Job by ending the ordeal and then, or his problems and all that, and then giving him twice the material wealth he had before and more children. Does that, or asked another way, does that indicate that we are going to get rewarded materially for serving God?
Well, he never wavered.
Yeah, he never wavered.
The biggest point isn't
No matter what
the
everybody
material,
told
the
him.
point is that he had it, not because God had given it to him. But
Because he didn't.
God did take it from him, not for the purpose of punishment, but for the purpose of smacking the devil.
Right, so-
God has restored to him that which he did have with, and I'm going to throw this out as a really kind of negative in this whole, God blessed him greatly. I'm sorry. He still lost all of his kids. He still went through a terrible ordeal.
Right.
I've got no idea, Jimmy, help us out here, the psychological scars. Because keeping in mind, God doesn't explain to Job, here's why I did what I did. And can God explain why I wiped out your family?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't think, well, first off, I think, as you were saying, like, this is a specific case. Like, you can't use this as this is what happens. Like, it was a very specific case, and I don't think that it translates, and like you said, it was a specific case where God pointed out Job to the devil and then allowed the devil to do all these things. So, yeah, it was a very specific instance, and it's certainly getting back all that still doesn't take away the pain from having to go through what he went through. Right.
The devil goes to God and says, what about Job? He says, "Look, you can do anything you want. God wasn't doing it. Satan was."
Right. Well, but God pointed Job out first, and then allowed Satan to do that. Yes.
We always want
Yeah.
to blame God. God did this.
Well, and that's what the discussion that's going to happen with Job and his friends is kind of along those lines, right? I say friends because I don't know how much they were actually friends. What do you call them? I lost the word here. What's that?
Critics.
Not critics. The people, contemporaries. Contemporaries, I guess, is the word. Okay, so and actually that's so. So at the end of chapter 2, Job's 3 friends arrive, and what do they do when they arrive?
Didn't they, well, I know sometime, was it on the way or when they arrived, that they tore their robes and they put the dirt on their, dust on their heads?
Yeah, yep, they do that, and they sit with him for 7 days. Yep, for 7 days, and I guess there's some discussion about is 7 days really 7 days, or is it like just a long time or whatever? But a while, but it says 7 days, so I would say 7 days. So they sat with him for basically a week, and nobody says anything. And we talked a little bit about how that can be a good thing sometimes, right? Just to sit with somebody and be there with them, not have to say something. So they do that, and then Job finally starts to talk. And in chapter 3, he gives a pretty strong lament to his situation. He wishes that he had never been born, and he asks several questions about why things happen the way they do, basically, or why things are the way they are. Who does Job blame for what has happened to him? Going back to what Roy just said.
He sort of puts blame on God.
On God, yeah. So if you go to verse 23 there, in chapter 3, why is light given to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in? So he kind of starts to call out God. And I kind of sum up his questions by saying, why does God let people see something good? Why does he give them something good and then take it away? Like, how cruel is that, right? Is basically what he's saying. So he starts, or he also says, why would God provide hope for good and then it turns to bad? That's just kind of my interpretation of the way that he's asking the questions.
He really couldn't tell Job what was going on because he knew if he did, the devil would jump
Well, no, well, the devil only had the power over Job up to what God gave him. And in fact, he said that, like, at first it was like, at first he said, you could do this, but don't touch him. And then when the second round came back, it was like, okay, you can touch him, but you can't kill him. So that, like, God set the rules as to what was allowed to happen there. So in Job 3 and well, it's just 3, excuse me. So he says he has these questions. One question that I have from this and some of the other things that we've gone over that he said, how does Job's view of death as an escape from earth's miseries compare to the revelation we have in the New Testament? How do we view death? We're scared of it because it's the unknown, but we also have a hope that he didn't necessarily have, because we've seen the revelation of Jesus and then what the things that we've seen in the New Testament. So we have a better view, I would say, than what he had at this point. Although as we go through, you will see some glimpses of a little bit of a different view, and then it kind of fall back, like it goes back and forth as we go. So initially, Job's friends just sit with him, and then after Job starts talking, then we get to the next section, and this is actually the last section that we covered, which is basically the first set of back and forth dialogue between Job and his friends, and that's in chapters 4 through 14. So to get us back through that and just kind of where we were at, I'll just ask a bunch of questions. This is where the bigger part of the quiz comes in, and we'll just cover it real quick. And like I said, once we get through this, then next week we'll pick up with the second set of speeches back and forth between Job and his friends. All right, so first, why does Eliphaz, who is we think the oldest friend that came, why does he feel the need to respond to Job at this point? We talked about how it might be good not to say anything, but at this point he feels he has to say something.
I think it's because that he felt that Job had sinned, and that with his innocence, they would prosper. It would, because he prospered when things were going good for him, but
Yeah, and actually, that's just, maybe I should have asked that question first. What was the traditional position of the day regarding suffering of the righteous and upright? Yeah, it was a
punishment.
Yeah, if you did good, you were rewarded, and if you did bad, you were punished. In verse 7, Eliphaz says, "Whoever perished by being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed?" So show me this. And of course, Job is like, I can show you that, right? Not in those words exactly, but yeah, I've seen that happen. So the traditional position was you had to do something bad if you were getting punished like this. So what does he say is the reason that bad things have happened to Job as a consequence of that belief system? Job must have done something really bad, right? But it's also interesting that how Eliphaz says, he indicates that he's hesitant to say anything to Job in his distress, but then he launches into a rebuke because of the way Job's talking, because of Job's words. He says Job has helped others, but when it comes to him, he is impatient. I don't know maybe a different version might have a different word there, but I think mine says impatient. So he's impatient when bad things start happening to him.
Started happening.
Or have been happening to him. Yeah.
Everything's going down.
Yeah.
You're just having a bit of bad luck.
You're just having a bit, yeah. Well, that's why they're like, you must have done something really bad, and you're just not willing to tell us about it. Now, here's an interesting question that we talked a little bit about. Where does Eliphaz says some of his information came from? You guys remember?
In a dream.
Yeah, a vision or a dream or from a spirit. And that is something that really tells us how, whenever you hear people talking about how something's been revealed to them or that they've received this revelation, we got to be really careful with that, right? Subjective revelation is pretty dangerous.
Not be eating pastrami late at night.
Yeah, be careful what you eat and drink and all those kind of things. So, but it can be very, when people start interpreting things in their own way and not, from God's word, we're opening ourselves up for a lot of trouble. So we got to be aware of that. Okay, so at this point, what does Job compare his friends to? And we're probably somewhere in like 6 or 7 at this point. 6, I think, is where we're talking. What does he compare his friends to? Or what might we call them today? Hypocrites? Not well, maybe to some degree. Fair weather friends, maybe.
Well, I'm going to give his friends some credit that we often don't. They're not fair weather friends.
No, they came to see him. Yep.
They came, and while he's still in his distress, they're still there. They're just not exactly what I'd call the most supportive group, but they are still there with him all the same.
I agree with that.
In
Yep.
their mind, and I didn't say they're right in this, but in their mind, they are trying to help him.
Right, and we talked a little bit about that. We got to be aware of how we're trying to help people, right? Like what we're willing to say.
In our thinking, I think a lot of times, we think we have to set things right, and we want to straighten the guy out.
Mm-hmm.
We've taken church discipline one step up further away from where God really intended it to be. He intended it to be a saving thing, to bring the person back, instead of just pointing fingers.
Yeah, we tend to like to kick people when they're down.
Yeah.
And that's not what we're supposed to be doing. And it's also, you got to be aware of the timing here. Like, I mean, when we talked about this, when somebody's hurting, that's not the best time to have a big theological discussion about this or that. And that's what happens here, is that it turns into a big discussion about why Job had to have done something wrong. So they're not really, at this point, whoever said critics, I think that's a good way to describe them. They're critics. Of him, but yeah, we should give them credit. It's not like they just left him hanging and didn't come to see him. They did come, and they sat with him for a week without saying anything. So there's some good things here, just like what we talked about with Job's wife. It's not all bad. She was still there, suffering through it. So just like those things, we shouldn't just think of it all as negative, even though the story turns negative here. Elton and Terry, yeah.
Each one of his friends gave him a sermon.
Yeah.
A
many sermons, yeah.
and work out himself.
Right.
Rather than reliance on God, which what Job was doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, yeah, it's that whole timing of things. When's the right time to say this versus when's the right time to say that? Yeah.
Think of it like this. A lot of people today, when somebody's ill and they're not doing well, do you ever notice how a lot of people will come to visit you because they're guilty over things they've done in their life to you, and they come and ask you to forgive them because they think something's going to happen?
Let me say the way I think I'm interpreting that. Like, we need to also make sure that our motivations are correct when we're talking to someone like that. We're not doing it for ourselves.
But a lot of people do that today. That's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, because if you're doing it over a feeling of guilt or something like that, I mean, you still probably should do it, but you got to make sure that you're doing it the right way, like that you're not in it for the wrong reasons. So,
That's what I'm wondering.
yeah. Well, that'll come back around on them to some degree here as they're discussing things as well. So at the same time here, why does Job bitterly complain against God? And this was a point that I think Charles made when we were going through the class. I said because I think he's losing hope at this point. And he doesn't think God has treated him fairly, and he's longing for relief, and he doesn't see a possibility of this happening. Like, he doesn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. Like, he only sees it getting worse. But whenever you get into that situation, what did we talk about? Is there something somebody can say to you at that point? Not really. You're going to have to rely on your character, is what we talked about. What you've built, the faith you've built. And that's why it's so important that we build that faith when we're going through good times, because you need it for the bad times. When do people usually turn to God? During the bad times, right? Yeah. That's when you see that people start to turn to God. But we need to be doing it in the good times so that we have that foundation.
We don't pay any attention to all the messages God tries to send us through the Word and through other people until
Right.
it is a bad time.
Yeah, only when you might say, and this is a bad phrase, but when he has our attention, when something's happened that's got us looking that way, I think to that point, I guess you would go to some scriptures in the New Testament, and I'm horrible at quoting scripture, as you guys know, so I can't do that. But paraphrasing, how hard it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom. Whenever things are going well and you're relying on yourself, how hard is it for us to turn to God? People don't do it, and that people have to be convinced that they need God. We have to be convinced that we need Him, and we need to convince others that they need Him. Yeah.
I was going to say, we see the light, but we rarely turn until we feel the heat.
Right.
And it's definitely when we feel that, when God has our attention, that we make that change. I found it really interesting, and you mentioned too, is Job and his as he was going through these inflictions, right? And I know you guys discussed this earlier another time, and if I'm rehashing something you've already pointed out, I apologize. But I really found it interesting how, when you look at when you're back in chapter 1, you have the first, I'll call it, say, phase of what's been inflicted upon Job, right? You've had, his all of his family, his kids, have died. He's been removed of all of his personal wealth, right? Mm-hmm. And his response, obviously, here in verse 21, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. His first level, or phase 1, is a loss of everything outside of himself, right? And his response is, we'll say, in somewhat positive, right? It is what it is, right? He's responding to God's, and saying, hey, it is what it is. It's been removed from him. But and we want to make sure that we take note of this too. On another day, the angels came, starting in chapter 2. It doesn't mean it was the very next day. There was probably a length of time where he's now had that removed from him, right? And now he's getting another wave, right? He's getting another phase where now it's a personal affliction, right? Not only has all his wealth and his family been taken from him, but now he's getting personally, and one of the things I take from that is that, where people fall into despair, right? So maybe the first wave is, okay, I can handle that, right? Now the second wave, he's getting hammered personally and physically, and now he's gone to the next level, right? Where he's now cursing the day he's been born, right?
Right.
And he's now having an issue with, feeling why is God allowing this to happen, right? Why am I being afflicted? And he's really fallen to that state of despair. To what you were saying before is that, once you hit that level, all the sermons and all the things that could be pointed out in long, dissertation doesn't matter, right? He's always going to go back to what he built beforehand.
Right.
Which is
Yeah. I've heard it said on that. And first off, don't nobody worry about saying something that's already been covering something that's already been said. I do that all the time myself. And there's always a different perspective for people to bring out. So please, everybody, just feel free to rehash something or reiterate something. But I've heard it said. Somebody said something about, I forget exactly how the story goes, but talking about, they were asked about, why do you need to go to church every Sunday? can you even tell me what was preached last Sunday? Like the question, like, and this is where I always talk about, I can't even remember what I taught last Sunday half the time. So yes, of course, not everybody, you don't remember that. But the answer that the person gave was, well, I don't remember what I ate last Friday either, but it kept me alive. So we're built, you may not remember specifically what's talked about this week or last week, but we are building that foundation by repetition, by study, by work. We talked about it's not just the matter of study and listening and talking. We also have to do. So it's something it's a foundation that we build each day of our lives as we go. So it's not something that we're just once and done, or that we should do every once in a while. I mean, we need to stay in it, and we need to build that foundation as we go. Because once we get to that point, and we're all going to get it. We talked about that. We're all going to hit that point at some point somewhere along the way where we're going to have troubles. If you haven't already, most of you probably already have had it. But if we haven't, we're going to hit it. So that's just something we know. So we need to be always working on our faith and on our character to build that.
It's encouraging to know, though, too, that, the Lord allowed that time between the first phase and the second phase, of that, calamity to come upon Job, and knowing that, hey, he's not going to overload us. Even because he could have just said, hey, you can do whatever you want, just don't kill him. He could have said that from the get-go. And I would be questioned of whether Job would have been able to handle all that all at one time.
It's a good question, yeah. How much can we handle? And now then we talked about that too, as far as what was the passage that talks about God will not give you more than you can handle, but will provide a way of escape. And what do we say? Sometimes that escape is what? Death. Yeah, I mean, like, Christians have been killed, right? We're killed, especially, they still are killed at various places in the world. So we are not promised that the way of escape is what we want it to be. When it comes down to it, there is a way of escape as long as we stay faithful to God. Unto death, right? Yeah. So we got to keep that in mind, that it's not necessarily what we want, what we think of.
Happens a lot.
Yeah. Elton.
Earlier when we started this class, you mentioned the fact about fear of death, and it was brought up. I think that right there has a bearing on the age of the individual. Because we realize if we've been a student of the Bible, we realize that is the ultimate reward.
You mean as far as whether we're looking, and certainly whenever somebody is a Christian and is suffering something health-wise, they may look forward to that. There is different perspectives as far as where we are at in our life.
Young or
and younger people tend to think that there's no way they're going to die.
yeah.
And they're not really afraid of it, right?
I remember that years ago.
So there is a different perspective on that depending on kind of where we're at in our walk of faith and in our lives on that. Okay, so I didn't get quite through all my questions on our review here, so we'll have to wrap that up next week. But next week we will get into our second set of discussions between Job and his friends, and we'll finish up reviewing the first set. So thanks everybody for your comments, and